Good morning, and I'd like to thank you for joining us here at the Greenbrier Church online. If you've joined us before, you might have heard me say that I'm trying to get as far away from social media as I possibly can. The major reason is because of the amount of anger that seems to ooze from every nook and cranny. Every post, every meme, every interaction seems to be flooded in a tidal wave of anger. I truly believe that this tidal wave of anger is a much larger threat to our community and our country than the current epidemic that's keeping us all isolated. Every one of us are familiar with keyboard commandos, but we also encounter people who seem to be constantly angry or rageaholics, folks who spend their days walking around with a smoldering inferno just inside, waiting for the opportunity to explode. They've already decided that they're angry. They just spend their day looking for an excuse to voice that anger. Now, before you point a finger or begin to think about somebody else who seems to have an anger problem, we first need to ask ourselves, how many times have the words idiot, stupid, moron, dummy passed our lips in the last week? Maybe you've never used the word racha like Jesus does in this sermon, but I would imagine that it's not only folks on social media that have used their words to disrespect someone or tear them down. I'm going to start with the main point of the teaching in this X-rated sermon today, and that's that our words and murder have something to do with each other. It all begins with disrespect for someone created in God's image. What ends in murder begins with murderous thoughts and disrespectful words. We've become experts at sarcasm and insults. We're experts at destroying relationships. And it always begins with disrespect. In this section of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus shows us a way different from the world, a better way, a way of reconciliation. You see, we're called to build, not to destroy. And in a world like ours, where relationships are so easily destroyed, we find that it's really difficult to build. We need to hear what Jesus has to say about this. He starts this section of teaching the same way that he's going to begin the next 5 sections. You have heard that it was said. And Jesus wants to challenge our way of thinking. He starts with the way that we think about one another. Because we've heard it said, you shall not murder. There are days, especially difficult days, when I feel pretty good about myself at night because I went all day without killing anybody. Now, you might think this verse doesn't apply to you since you've never killed anyone. I mean, you have to be a pretty good person because you've kept this commandment your whole life. We think as long as I mind my business and I don't murder anybody along the way, we're good. And if Jesus would have just left it there, then we could get really comfortable in our self-righteousness. But Jesus isn't going to leave it there. He continues, anyone who's angry with his brother is in danger of judgment. Now, I know that we do really, really well on that murder side, but it's the anger side that tends to get us, doesn't it? Especially with so many of us living in isolation, when most of our interaction with one another comes through a screen, it seems that everybody's just losing their minds. We're also defensive and angry. And unfortunately, Christians aren't immune. Actually, the folks that I was having the most difficult with on social media were folks that had Bible verses all in their news feeds. You see, as a group, it seems that oftentimes Christians are some of the angriest people we know. Yet in this part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is really clear that murder begins with our anger. I imagine sometimes that Jesus looks at me and says, hey, Jeremy, congratulations on not killing anybody today, but how are you doing on that anger problem? You see, murderous behavior will get you in trouble with man, but a murderous attitude will get you in trouble with God. In the eyes of God, hateful feelings are just as bad as hateful actions. Once again, this is a heart issue because our heart is where evil begins. I tried to make the point last week that having a pure heart is much more difficult than having pure actions. You see, oftentimes we control our outward actions enough to fool the people around us. But if you ever saw into somebody's heart, you would see that something quite different is happening there. For instance, I can hide the anger that I have for somebody else. I can even treat them in a way that would make them believe that I liked them. All the time, I'm harboring this hate in my heart. If you want your life to be set free from sin, we got to make sure that not only do we not murder people, we have to stop despising them in our heart. We have to give up our anger towards them. More than that, we have to love them. You may not commit a murder, but ever since Cain murdered Abel, it all starts with anger and resentment. Sometimes the only difference between us and somebody who actually committed a murder is that they had the courage and the opportunity to carry it out. Your anger may seem like a small thing to you, but every big thing begins as a small thing. Jesus is saying that your unresolved anger is a big thing. So let's come back to how he describes this anger and the unusual words that Jesus uses in the text. He says if you were to say to your brother racha, you're in danger of judgment. Now, the word racha is an Aramaic word. It sounds like you're clearing your throat so that you can spit on someone. It was used to designate that you thought somebody was mentally and spiritually empty. He says if you say to a person, you fool, you're in danger of hell. And unfortunately, we have to use the word fool here, not because it's the magical word that'll get you thrown in hell, but because there's not a good translation in English for what Jesus is trying to say. It's actually profanity. It's profanity used to cut at the very essence of a person's worth, and that's what anger does. It tears people down and raises questions about their worth as a person. We allow our anger to make us feel superior to other people, the people that offend us. And it feels really good to give them a piece of our mind, but in the eyes of God, we've stepped over a line. You see, we stop seeing people and we only see them as aggravations and problems. And what makes matters worse is we don't even realize what we're doing is wrong. How many times have you been in an argument that kind of devolved into name calling? And then as the anger progressed, you begin to insult them and the anger escalates, and without even knowing it, you've crossed a line. Jesus is saying the Christian life is not about letting people have it every time they do something you don't like. It's about showing people the same love and compassion that God shows us every day. In the words of Colossians 3:13, we read, it's about forgiving one another as the Lord forgave you. Jesus is serious about our anger. He says that our anger, both revealed and hidden, puts us in danger of the fire of hell. And you might think, well, he's just being unreasonable. But this whole X-rated sermon is a call to a new life, a life that resembles Jesus Christ. In the eyes of God, what we do with our words is just as important with what we do with our hands and our feet. Jesus is going to go on to say in Matthew 12, verse 36, I tell you, men will have to give an account on the day of judgment for every careless word they have uttered. For by your words you'll be justified, and by your words you'll be condemned. You might not care about what comes out of your mouth, but God does. It matters to him. And anytime we devalue somebody with careless words, we offend our God who created their lives. You see, that's the danger that our words put our souls into. We can't justify this or try to explain it away, because Jesus is going to continue in this sermon. He says, if you're on your way to worship and you remember that your brother has something against you, did you hear that? Jesus says that our words, that our relationships are so important that we need to forget about worshiping God until we are reconciled, or at least try to reconcile with our brothers and sisters. This is more important that our relationships are governed by respect and reconciliation and love. That's more important than anything else that can happen in a worship service. We're being called to replace our anger with a passion for reconciliation so that we'll become the peacemakers who will receive the blessing of being called the children of God. Can you imagine the impact on your city if every Christian set aside their anger? Okay, maybe that's a little big for you to imagine. So can you imagine the impact on your personal family if you decided to lay aside your anger? You know, I had the thought this week that I've never heard a preacher or a shepherd or deacon or Bible class teacher or any Christian say that their relationships were more important than their worship. Jesus isn't trying to shock us with his words. He's simply trying to impress on us how important it is for us to love one another. I mean, we tend to over focus on that 1 hour a week that we gather for worship. And I fully believe corporate worship is extremely important for my spiritual health. But Jesus is teaching that our relationships with other people are more important than coming and offering a sacrifice of worship. There's somebody out there with whom you need to be reconciled. And until you practice reconciliation, the power of forgiveness will never be fully present in your life. As far as I can find, reconciliation is the only thing God ever says that's more important than our worship of Him. Anger can only end when we try to reconcile. Because anger has to do with getting even, setting somebody straight, settling the score. But love sets out to forgive, to build up, to give value, to encourage, to reconcile. Anger pushes people away. Love pulls people near. And this is important because we can never have a right relationship with God if we don't have a right relationship with other people. They're intertwined. A bad relationship with someone else always interferes with my relationship with God. That's why we have to fix our relationships before we can come to worship. It's impossible to be right with God until we've made a concerted effort to be right with our fellow man. How do I know that? Because a little later in this X-rated sermon, Jesus is going to say, if you do not forgive men of their sins, your Father in heaven will not forgive you of your sins. Peacemaking has always been a priority for the people of God. All the way back in Genesis 13, the herdsmen of Abram and the herdsmen of Lot are quarreling and fighting over which group has the claim to the best land. And Abram says in verse 8, we don't need to be fighting like this. You're my nephew, we're family. You choose and take whatever piece of land you think is best. If you go left, I'll go right. If you go right, I'll go left. Why would Abraham go out of his way to make peace? I mean, Abram's the uncle. He's the older member of the family. He's the guy in charge. He's the man that God called to follow him and the one that God promised to bless. But here we see Abram giving over to Lot because he understood the call to live at peace. But he also fully believed that God can bless you whenever and wherever you are, even if you're in the midst of a desert. Paul says in Romans 12:18, if it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. I can't determine how you're going to act or treat me, but I can do everything I can to treat you with kindness and respect. Reconciliation is the heartbeat of Christ. It's what sent him to the cross. That's why we're called to be like him. The cure for anger is forgiveness. And if you're a child of God, forgiveness, it's not an option. We're commanded to forgive. One last passage from the pen of Paul, Colossians 3, starting in verse 13, we read, forbearing one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgive each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you must also forgive. And above all these things, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. Jesus is our model for forgiveness. We understand that Jesus hung on a cross he didn't deserve, but he hung on that cross for me and for you. I mean, he lived a perfect life. He helped people. He healed people. He preached the truth. He loved the least of these. He loved the lost. And in return for all of his love and all of his compassion, he was spit on, ridiculed, whipped, crucified. Yet as he hung on the cross in suffering and pain and agony, he prayed, he cried out, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. That's the whole reason we have the opportunity to gather at the table. You see, the greatest gift God has ever given mankind is forgiveness. When we gather to take the bread, we're reminded of the body of Christ that endured all of that torture. We remember that he was spit on, humiliated, endured the name-calling and the jeers of the crowd. When we look into the cup, we see the blood that Jesus willfully sacrificed so that we could have the forgiveness that our souls depend on when we fall short of what God's called us to be. We gather at the table because we have faith. We're imperfect. We felt angry. We've given into that anger. We've said and done things that devalued people made in the image of God. Yet when we gather at the table, we get to experience the beautiful gifts of mercy and grace. But it's also at the table that we have the opportunity to give Jesus our anger and strive to live a life of reconciliation and forgiveness. For some of you this morning, before you can even take these emblems, you're going to need to turn off the video and go find somebody you need to reconcile with. You're going to need to understand that God is calling you to reconcile over worship. For the rest of us, we need to consider a couple things. First, what have our words over the last 4 days revealed about our hearts? And secondly, how does it make you feel knowing that Jesus says that you will give an account on Judgment Day for every idle word that you've spoken? You see, Jesus is very serious about the words that we use, about the words that we say, because not only did he create us, he understands that out of our heart, the truth of who we are is shown through the words that we say. And when we say words that devalue other people, when we gossip, when we mimic, when we make fun of, when we name call, we devalue people created and made in the image of God. And their value, well, it was enough for Jesus to die for. So as we take the bread and we take the cup this morning, let's consider the question of what are our words actually revealing about our hearts? What are we saying about our faith in God? The real faith, the truth about how much we love and trust God through the words that we say. Jesus calls us to reconciliation, not only with himself, but with one another. And it's my prayer that today, as you gather around the table, that you will be able to find reconciliation with God. You'll be able to find the forgiveness that your souls ache and long for. Because God wants to call us home to be with him for all eternity. That's why we commune at the table. I hope you have a wonderful week. I hope that you take the opportunity that God gives you the courage to go out and to reconcile with people whom you need to reconcile with, so that as we gather together next week to worship, we can be totally and completely focused on our God, who is love and who loves completely. I hope you have a great week. Go in peace, and I'll see you soon.